Hi everyone, Heather here with astrologywithheather.com, and you're watching a very special free preview of my Mastering Pluto webinar. And so what you're about to watch here is the first 30 minutes or so of a 4+ hour webinar where we go really in depth into Pluto, its general influence in astrology, specific indicators for Pluto placements in your chart and what that means for you personally. We get into the cycles of Pluto on a personal level and the transits to and from Pluto and much, much more. And so you can find more information about this webinar at the link down in the description below. This is also a part of my Mastering the Outer Planets series, which goes really in depth into all of the outer planets. So we have a webinar on Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and of course Pluto, as well as a free bonus webinar called Mastering Jupiter that's coming up on April 11th. And this is only available to those who have registered for the entire series as a free gift to you. And so in this first video, and that link is down in the description below too, by the way. And so for this first video that we're going to be watching here, we're going to be diving deep into Pluto as a general influence in your chart and by transit and what that means. So I hope you find this information helpful and enjoy the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. All right, and so hi everyone. Hi Crystal, hi Jane, Cheryl, Via, Vanessa, Valerie, Lisa, Justin. Hi everyone. Hello Phyllis. So you guys are already starting to interact in the chat, and we've got a good number of people already in here. All right, so I think we're just going to get into it here. Oh, hi, you're in Boulder. I'm on the other side of the mountain, Luann. All right, I'm going to close the chat so that way we can start getting into the, you guys can keep chatting, it'll pop up for me, but I'm going to close this on my screen real quick. There we go. All right, so Pluto. I am super, super excited to be talking about Pluto in astrology. Like I mentioned at the very start of this is one of my favorite planets to talk about, one of my favorite topics. Pluto is a planet that gets a little bit of a bad rap because of some of the associations that we have with Pluto in modern astrology. So Pluto has this association with things like death and crisis and trauma and decomposition. You know, it's associated with things that, with like loss, because it's associated with these periods of major upheaval and transformation in our lives. But Pluto isn't only that, and Pluto isn't necessarily a malefic influence. In modern Western astrology, we actually, well, so let's take a backtrack here. When we're talking about malefic and benefic planets, we're really talking about traditional planets. So the planets that were utilized in traditional astrological modalities, you know, prior to the discovery of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so in traditional astrology, the two malefic planets are Saturn and Mars, and the two benefic planets are Venus and Jupiter. And so with these malefic and benefic planets come certain associations. The benefic planets are associated with a lot of things that we consider to be positive in this current frame of reality, and the malefic planets are associated with a lot of topics that we consider to be negative in this, you know, current state of reality from our perspective. That being said, malefic planets can bring really, really positive results even under certain circumstances, and benefic planets can bring negative results under certain circumstances. So it's not just black and white, cut and dry. And back in the day, it wasn't looked at through these lenses of such extremes. It was more like this has some associations that can bring bad things, but you know, it encompasses a whole spectrum of topics, and you know, same thing for the benefics. And so in modern times, we've discovered 3 new planets: Uranus, which we've done a webinar on, Neptune, which was our last webinar, and then Pluto, which was discovered most recently. And because Pluto has taken on certain meanings, people consider it in their own minds, or even like they might even phrase it in a way where they consider this planet to be a malefic influence, but technically it's not. It cannot be a benefic or malefic. We haven't made those distinctions yet with these more modern discoveries with the planets. And so that's one thing to kind of make note of. It is technically neutral. And in my experience as an astrologer, I've seen Pluto bring really, really positive, really incredible, beneficial things into people's lives. And I've also seen the exact opposite of that. And really what it depends on is what's going on in the birth chart and in transits. And especially in the birth chart, because really no transits can bring anything that's not already present as a potential in your natal chart. And so that's really where we're going to start here. So we're going to hopefully get into everything with Pluto so you can have a deep understanding of the way that Pluto shows up in your own chart and the potentials that it brings, both positive and negative, or maybe all positive or all negative for some people that are on those extreme ends of the spectrum. But for most of you, you're going to get a combination, a mixed bag of energies with Pluto. And then from there, we can understand what happens when there are transits to Pluto, or what happens when you are happen to be at a certain point in the cycle of Pluto, in your own personal Pluto cycle. And so these are the things that we're going to look at today. And so that's kind of how we're going to frame it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of information, background information about Pluto in a more general sense. We're going to get into Pluto in specific placements in the birth chart. And so hopefully you guys know where your Pluto is placed. I did include some supplemental materials for finding your natal Pluto placement and the important things that we're going to be looking at here. And then we'll get into activations of Pluto and also Pluto in transit to other planets in the chart. And that's what we're going to do. And by the way, with this presentation, for those who haven't taken a webinar with me before, I always include a ton of information on the presentation, just because I want this to serve as a reference guide or some sort of reference material for you guys that you can look back on when you want to remember something, or when you're, you need to pull up your notes on Pluto or whatever it is. So it's kind of its own separate thing. Something I just realized today that I could be doing is taking that and condensing it and making bullet points for the presentation and still giving you a reference guide. So probably in the future, I'll start doing that, because I was like, I wish there was a way for me to have this reference guide without having all this text on the screen. Of course there's a way. I don't know why I didn't think of that before. So there is going to be a lot of information on the screen. I'm not going to be reading off of the slides. That's just for you to take into account and to have for your own personal reference. I've also included a plain text version of the notes that you can find in Teachable under the supplemental materials section. And so you can download that, print it out, or pull it up as a Word document and take your own notes as we go along as well. And so you have both of those extra materials there, those supplemental materials. All right. So if you guys don't have any specific questions, so sharing again. Okay, now I know for sure that it's recording properly. So anyway, so the Phoenix is a really good symbolic representation of Pluto. And so that's kind of where we're starting here. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about here is the discovery of Pluto, especially when it comes to these outer planets that are more newly discovered. The discovery of the planet is thought to correspond with a certain shift of consciousness or a change in our awareness that wasn't accessible to us prior to the discovery of this new planet. And it usually coincides with the meaning and the symbology of the planet itself. And so this is a theory that's been posed by astrologer and theosophist Dean Rudyard, who is a very famous astrologer. He's more, Jungian and humanistic in his approach to astrology, and he is a theosophist, so you have to kind of take that into account. But one of the things he talks about is this symbolism of this discovery of a new planet and what takes place around the time within a couple of decades of the discovery of that planet. And it seems to hold pretty true. I mean, a lot of the meanings that are derived from these planets tend to correspond with these shifts in our society on a mass scale. And so Pluto was discovered on February 18th, 1930 at the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. I actually visited that observatory when I was living in Sedona, and it was pretty cool. It's not as easy to see things there as it was, because Flagstaff has gotten pretty large. I think it's technically a dark sky city, but it's still pretty bright. But back in the 1930s, I could imagine that you were just out in the woods and, seeing all the stars and all of that pretty easily. And So I got to actually go to the observatory where Pluto was discovered. And Pluto was actually calculated, I think, about 10 years prior to its discovery. So the placement of Pluto was calculated based on the irregular orbits of Uranus and Neptune. And so they knew that there was another body farther out, and then they were looking for it, right, based on the calculations of where it should be. And so this Clyde Tombaugh guy, he's the one that actually discovered Pluto, but Lowell was actually the guy that made the calculations and was searching for it for over a decade before it was actually discovered by somebody else. And so the observatory was named for him. And so anyway, many significant events occurred in the decade or so surrounding Pluto's discovery. And so in modern astrology, Pluto has a lot of associations with things like debt and finance, especially when it comes to other people's money or manipulation of the financial system, or the connection between power and money. And so one of the big things that happened around the time of Pluto's discovery, of course, if you look at the time frame, 1930, was the Great Depression. So it corresponded very perfectly with the onset of the Great Depression. We had the stock market crash, and then the Great Depression started around that time. And so this caused a complete transformation of the financial system and the way that money was controlled and utilized. And it actually had some negative effects as well, in terms of just giving the government and some other institutions and banks more control over resources. And, some of the wealthy people who knew about this in advance got even wealthier as a result of this, financial crash that happened, while the poor got poorer. And that's actually a theme that we're going to come back to, because we're in a certain time frame right now with Jupiter in a conjunction with Pluto that's reflecting what occurred just prior to the last recession, when we had the housing market collapse. And so that's going to be occurring this year 3 times. And so a lot of financial analysts outside of astrology are predicting that we're going to come into a recession before the end of the year. And so Pluto tends to have this association with like very large extreme changes in our overall financial situation, like as a whole, not just on an individual level, because that can absolutely be part of it too, but kind of on a grander scale in the big scheme of things. And so because of the Great Depression, and there was a lot of other stuff going on too besides Pluto's discovery astrologically that corresponded with the Great Depression. We had Uranus and Taurus, which is going on right now. I don't want to scare you guys about that, because I don't think we're going into another Great Depression. But there were other things that we have to look at, but that's one of the things, was this discovery of Pluto. And so this caused a transformation in, especially in the United States. A lot of these sort of historical references are going to be from the vantage point of the US, just because that's what I'm most familiar with. And I did do some research to, pick out some other things that we can look at too. But just things that I know off the top of my head that I added to these slides are mostly going to be US history, because that's what we learned in schools here. So I apologize for that, but there's going to be stuff more about global occurrences. And the stock market crash affected people all over the place. And there was also famine around that time too. We had the Dust Bowl. And so there was a lot going on in terms of just scarcity and this like fear around not having enough, right? And so a lot of the Pluto energy, it stems from this like fear-based energy, or this like visceral energy when it comes to fear over just life-sustaining things. And so we'll get into that, as we move into this lecture as well. But so we had a lot of different changes to the way that that finances on a grander scale were held. Another thing that happened around this time was there was a huge shift in consciousness around death, especially death on a mass scale, because of a few different things. We had the beginning of World War II. So Hitler came into power in 1939, or not in 1939. He came into power shortly after Pluto's discovery, and that actually led to World War II, which began in 1939. And this, of course, led to hundreds and thousands of people in many different countries across the world. So it was like a global experience of mass death due to this like war and this really sort of sinister energy where, you know, this was a person who was trying to control everything. And, you know, it was a very interesting association that occurred with that. And because World War II was going on and we had things like, you know, Pearl Harbor and all of that, the United States actually developed the atomic bomb around that time. So that led to, or not the United States only, but so anyway, this leads to the discovery and the development of the atomic bomb. And so a lot of people associate Pluto with this newfound consciousness around our ability to essentially end all life, or to end life on a mass scale all at once at the push of a button, which is something that we didn't have prior to this time period. And so nuclear fission was discovered, the atomic bomb was created, and then, you know, the United States did drop bombs on Japan, most notably at Hiroshima. So we had the Holocaust, Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima, all of these things. We also had the Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936. Another thing that occurred that changed our consciousness around death, and that was kind of extreme, was the Selective Service Act in the United States, which requires that all males over the age of 18 register for selective service so they can be drafted into war as needed. And so now all of a sudden you don't have as much power and control over your fate and your choice as to whether or not you want to put yourself at risk of death by going to war and, you know, having to kill other people. And so a lot of energy around death where your control and your power was stripped from you if you were a man of a certain age. And I mean, it's still a potential today in the United States. And so this ushered in this new age where there was a new consciousness emerging around money, power, death, control, all of these things. And so that's part of where we get this really sort of negative association with Pluto. And Pluto does have a correspondence to these things. I mean, it can be an energy that's really dark and really difficult to deal with on a lot of levels. And so, you know, Pluto was originally just, when Pluto was originally discovered, it was considered to be the 9th planet in our solar system. But that actually changed in 2006. After Eris was discovered in 2005, because Eris is actually larger than Pluto. It has an elliptical orbit, but it's sort of an irregular orbit that goes outside of the normal pattern. And for whatever reason, scientists decided that this couldn't be a planet, and if Pluto was smaller than Eris, then Pluto couldn't be a planet anymore. And that's kind of its own story. If I did like a webinar on Eris, that would be an interesting topic to dive into. But yeah, so Pluto was demoted, but we still, in astrology, for whatever reason, in modern astrology, we tend to hold it to the status of being a planet still. Because it is really impactful. When you have it impacting you by transit, or when it's placed really strongly in the chart, there's a definite experience there. So, and we'll get into that too. And this is just kind of a little rundown of some of the metrics for Pluto for anyone who's interested. And it's not super relevant to the astrology, but it's something that you can glance over. The one thing that is relevant to the astrology is that there's this tendency that's sort of strange, because a lot of these planets, before we get into the outer planets, they were discovered well before we could actually go and like see the planets through sending out these different devices or looking at it through telescopes. And so we didn't know very much about the conditions of these planets, but oddly enough, you know, and maybe we did, and maybe this is like something that comes from like a completely different time period before our own written history. That's a whole topic in and of itself, but theoretically we had no idea, right? And so now that we're visiting these planets and we're seeing them more closely, there seems to be a correspondence between the conditions of the planet and what it's made out of and all these different things, and the size and the position in the solar system, of course, because we could kind of determine bright versus, you know, far away, and fast versus slow moving. But there's this correspondence between what's going on with the planet in actuality, like physically, and what we consider to be the meaning of that planet more symbolically in astrology. And so one of the things with Pluto is that, first off, it's really far away. So it's kind of this like outsider perspective, but it's also super, super cold. And that is definitely one of the qualities of Pluto. When you have a strong Pluto placement, you can appear to be very cold and closed off, but Pluto has a heart on it, right? And one of the things that's kind of cool about that is that, you know, Pluto appears to be very cold, very callous, very closed off, very hard to read, you know, from an outside perspective. But once you really get to know somebody, once you get there, so once you arrive at Pluto on the Voyager, if you're like, you know, hitching a ride on it or something, you see that it has a heart, right? And so Pluto is an energy that's deeply, deeply passionate and that feels things very, very intensely and really takes things to heart. But it's just that outwardly people don't necessarily see that because Pluto is a little withholding when it comes to its external expression of emotion. All right, and then the final thing before we get into Pluto in this day and age and what it all means is we're going to get into the mythology of Pluto. And one thing I want to say before we get into that is that there's sort of a danger of like wanting to take the mythology of these newly discovered planets and to just paste them onto the planet. And that doesn't always work. You know, there are certain associations with Pluto / Hades in Greek and Roman mythology and what it represents in actuality, because I don't think that these things happen on accident, right? There's the law of correspondence. Everything is connected, as above, so below. And so, you know, I do see this association and I do believe that it's accurate, but you can't just always take that mythology and paste it onto the planet. And it doesn't work fully with the newly discovered planets for a variety of reasons. I think for one, we might not fully understand the mythology and what it deeply means. And so by discovering from a more objective standpoint through observation what the planetary associations are, we can actually get a deeper understanding of the planet itself and the mythology around the namesake for that planet. But also it just like they did things differently back in the day. You know, these gods were named for the planets or vice versa because of these really strong associations with the energies there. So it's not super cut and dry with Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and especially when you get into all these asteroids that are all over the place that people want to put into the chart and look at. But there is usually some loose association. And so Pluto was Hades in Greek mythology. And so there are some things that really correspond with that energy that are accurate for Pluto. Pluto was known as or Pluto or Hades was known as the Lord of the underworld. And so he was the one that controlled and supervised the underworld. However, back then, the underworld did not have the same meaning as it does today. It's not the same as Christian hell. They actually had two separate like levels in the underworld, or I think there were more than two, but there were two main levels. So there was the underworld, which Hades was, you know, the ruler of, and then there was Tartarus, which was below the underworld, which is where the really evil souls would go to get tortured. And Hades didn't torture anyone. He just sort of oversaw the proceedings to make sure that people were getting what they deserved and everything was fair and accurate. So there's also this association with fairness. And also Pluto in Libra, and they have this like sort of weird connection that we'll get into. Where it's almost like Pluto is has a natural affinity for the sign of Libra, and that could be that energy of that fairness and that balance. So this is, and also the underworld wasn't just the underworld, right? It wasn't just like this place that was like hell where people went to get tortured. It's where the souls were received after they died and all of that. And, you know, sometimes they would go to Tartarus, they would be tortured and all of that. And once Pluto got a hold of your soul, Pluto would keep it. Pluto was like obsessive over maintaining the souls that he was ruling over. Nobody could leave. He would get very upset if somebody tried to leave hell, or not hell, I shouldn't call it hell. If somebody tried to leave the underworld, right? And so if somebody tries to leave the underworld, Pluto gets very possessive and upset about it, and he's like obsessive with keeping them there. But the other thing too with the underworld is that, especially when you look at the Roman mythology, it's not considered to be something super negative, because the underworld is also where life comes from. right? So a lot of really important things that contribute to our physical wealth come from the soil. So we have things like actual soil, minerals, precious metals, things like that. And so especially the Romans would actually pay more attention to Pluto and call on Pluto for wealth, right? For accumulating wealth, for having healthy soil, for having, you know, minerals and things like that on their land and property. So there was that association as well. So Pluto became associated with wealth on a physical level, but it's also this like deep underworld Hades energy. Okay, and so there was, you know, a certain level of fear though around invoking the attention of Pluto, and so there's not a lot of depictions of Pluto in the artwork from these time periods. This is actually a modern depiction from like just a statue you can buy on Amazon. You can see that he has his three-headed dog, and you know, he looks kind of like Neptune, but he's kind of stern. He has this skull on his belt. I mean, he wasn't really depicted very often, and when he was, he probably didn't look this stern or this like menacing as this guy does. And he wasn't responsible for judging anyone. He was just kind of there again to oversee everything. But the fear around invoking Pluto was you didn't want to draw his attention because you didn't want, you know, your soul to be taken into the underworld, so you didn't want to attract death. It's kind of like calling on the Grim Reaper or something like that. So they didn't depict him quite as frequently. In Roman mythology, it's a little bit different. They weren't as afraid of this Pluto energy because they consider it to be a wealth-giving energy. All right, and then I'm going to get into the general energy of Pluto in astrology, and then we'll stop for a few questions here. So in the astrology, Pluto is associated with, first and foremost, it's an outer planet, and it's the outermost planet that we consider to be a planet in modern Western astrology. And so the further out the planets go, the more subtle their effects are, the more gradual their impact would be, and the more transpersonal and psychological and transformational the influence will be. And so Pluto has this huge association with psychology and with deep inner work and with psychological power, with passion, intensity, obsessions, compulsions, things that are more internalized. And so there's more of a psychological influence of Pluto, but also a psychic influence. Pluto is super, super magnetic. It's an energy that really draws things in. And so part of that is because Pluto brings this like laser focused energy where if somebody has a strong Pluto placement, wherever it is in their chart, they're able to really, they become very deeply passionate, very connected to their desires on a visceral sort of core level. And they're very easily able to energetically just draw in through this sort of psychic power, whatever it is they're trying to draw in or manifest in their lives. They'll draw in the right people, the situations, the actual substances they need to create this reality that they really desire on this root level, but they have to be deeply connected to it, and that's sort of the catch. With Pluto energy, you can't just decide all arbitrarily because your mind thinks that you need this and that this will be the solution to all of your problems. Like maybe you're feeling like you're a little down and out and you're like, $1 million will solve this. I desire $1 million. Is that really what your soul wants on a deep level? Or is that what your brain wants because you think if you had $1 million, you could pay off your bills and all your problems will be solved, right? So that's kind of the distinction. Pluto is all in, you know, you have to be all in wholly and fully and completely, and you can't control that with your mind, you know, in terms of like what you deeply desire and what your soul is craving. That's something that's just innate. And so if it's innately true, if it's innately what you desire, Pluto can help you to bring that into your life. At the same time, when you have a strong Pluto energy, the exact opposite can be true, where if there's something that you deeply don't want, even if you're trying to tell yourself that you want it in your head, like, oh, I want this because this, and this, or I want to keep this person in my life because, you know, it feels good in the moment to be with them. If it's not in alignment with what you really truly desire, it's not going to last, and you're going to energetically push it away, kind of like this explosive energy. So Pluto's kind of magnetic, right? If you think about two magnets that go together, or when you're trying to put them together, they'll either clamp together to the point where it's like kind of too forceful if you have some strong magnets, or if you flip them the other way, they'll repel each other. And if you try to like push them together, it just won't happen. And that's the same with that Pluto energy. It's very magnetic. It's also an energy that works in extremes. So it's very black and white. Pluto is, like I said before, it's either all in or all out. There's no middle ground. There's no gray area when you're dealing with Pluto. And so when you're trying to hold on to things that you're not truly all in with, it creates a lot of suffering and a lot of difficulty for people. And that's part of the reason why Pluto is associated with a psychological crisis in people's lives. And that's really the main thing it's associated with, is psychological crises. And a lot of times these psychological issues and transformations that we're going through can create this manifestation of actual physical experience where you need to let go of something and purge something, but that doesn't have to be the case. A lot of times people will see these Pluto transits coming up in their lives and they're like worried and fearful, like, oh my God, you know, like I have Pluto conjunct my moon. Is someone in my family gonna die? More times than not, that's not the case unless you have some other indicators that would show something like that happening. And Saturn tends to be more responsible for actual physical death than Pluto. The combination can bring that, but there's usually a Saturn thing going on too. So Pluto by itself brings psychological crises, and there can be some physical manifestation, but the type of physical manifestation is not dependent on Pluto. It's dependent on the other planets involved and other transits going on in your chart and other influences and activations based on different timing techniques. So it's not always something physical, but it's always felt on a visceral, deep level. Pluto is associated with past life karma as well. So people who are into things like karmic and evolutionary astrology will focus quite heavily on Pluto because it does have this association with these past life experiences that can be very traumatic sometimes, but at the very least, it's kind of like this energy that we obsess over unconsciously that is carried over from these experiences that we don't have conscious access to in this lifetime. And then again, shows us where we have a lot of personal power, which can be tapped into when needed. And it's associated with these deep traumas and fears and insecurities that drive our behavior, that control us from the outside or from the inside out. Because, you know, when we're living with these fears and anxieties, they're controlling or driving our behavior in some way. It's also like the type of fear that's super, super core and basal. So it's like fear for survival. That's the type of energy that Pluto brings. And that's also part of the reason why there's such an association with finance with Pluto, because in this day and age, when you are afraid for your financial resources, these pieces of paper that literally are just nothing, that symbolically means something, right? So when you have a lot of fear over that, really what you're fearing for is not the money, it's the ability to maintain housing and shelter, to feed yourself, right? To take care of your physical needs, to keep you alive, because that's what money symbolizes at its like core level. And so that's part of that association there with money. So Pluto in astrology, it shows us where we harness a lot of personal power that can be tapped into when needed. It also shows where we have the ability to get down to the core truth beneath the surface, where we're in an area of our life where we're able to see things in a way that other people are not. We're able to really get in there and cut, you know, beyond all of the nonsense and get to the core issues, or to see things that are there for everyone to see, but they just don't, they miss it, right? And so people who have strong Pluto, or wherever Pluto is in your chart, shows you where you have that ability. Pluto on a more general mundane level rules occult sciences. It rules psychologists, psychic energy. It can be really intense with Pluto, like really intense. Researchers, because there's that energy of cutting through all of the nonsense and getting down to the core issue, and this obsessive energy with getting to the truth. Detectives, you know, things like that. So there's a lot of energy around those types of figures with that Pluto energy. Pluto also rules things like death and decomposition. So it literally rules compost. If you think about that association with Pluto as Hades and ruling the soil because of the underworld association, you know, things die, they decompose, and then they create rich soil. And so compost is something that's associated very literally with Pluto, because it's this energy of breaking things down and then being able to create something new from that from that decomposition process. So it's not necessarily that Pluto is starting something new for you. It's breaking things down in your life in order to create the right circumstances so something really strong and healthy can grow out of that space. So when people say Pluto's associated with death and rebirth, Pluto doesn't make birth happen. Pluto creates the circumstances for that birth to occur based on its decomposition process and this energy of sort of breaking things down. So that's Pluto there. Other things that are associated with Pluto. So power and control issues can be very intense with Pluto. There are certain Pluto placements that we'll talk about, like the Pluto in conjunction, where people can become obsessive over trying to figure everything out and control their environment in like all the ways. And that's a difficult placement to have, because the one thing that is certain in this lifetime is that nothing is certain and that everything is constantly changing, and you can't control everything that's going on in your environment and all the people around you. But Pluto in conjunction people and other strong Pluto placements, they might want to try to do that. So they're always trying to figure things out so they can control it. But the way to deal with this energy is to relinquish control. The more you try to control things with Pluto, the more you internally will suffer. And so it's an energy where you have to learn to surrender and let go and just trust that things are going to work out, and that the things that are ending that you're trying to hold on to are going to create that compost. They're going to create that mineral rich soil for new, really beautiful things to grow out of, because that's almost always the case with Pluto. And so that's the other thing too, is that people tend to want to hold on to things when they're experiencing really strong Pluto energy. And the same thing with Pluto in a strong placement in your chart. There's this energy around wanting to really hold on to things because you have psychological or emotional attachments to these things. And you're afraid that if you let go of these things, your safety and security will be at stake on that basal sort of fear-based survival level. And that's not usually the case, but that's why when you go through this Pluto transit and you have to let go of a certain circumstance in your life, or you have a transit to your natal Pluto and things are starting to fall away, and you know that these things are begging to be let go of, that's why people tend to hold on to these things and they tend to suffer, right? And it's usually based on fear. It's like fear, if I let this go, I have nothing, right? What do I have? Because you can't see where the birth is going to happen yet, because Pluto's not necessarily causing the birth directly. It's not as an association with new beginnings. It's an association with the endings that create those circumstances for new beginnings. And I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I want to drive that point home, because there's a lot of that birth energy that people talk about with Pluto, and I really don't see that as being like an actual, like, this is how things are born. It's because of that decomposition. And you can't have birth without death, right? And that is what Pluto really shows us. So in terms of like that psychological energy, Pluto sometimes can manifest in yourself or in other people in your life in a way that's manipulative or narcissistic, or where you're going to have people who are like vampiric on a psychic level, because there's that strong psychic energy with Pluto that's very focused and very deliberate. And so people who have strong Pluto placements, who are maybe not the best people, they know how to use that, right? And they can really see what makes you tick and how to get into your head and to do the things that are going to cause you to feel unsafe, so that way they can control you, because then, maybe they'll turn to you, or whatever it is that they're trying to do with their little manipulation process. So I've seen many, many times people with like strong Pluto placements in their 7th house with Pluto very negatively aspected, where they dated someone or they married someone who they described as emotionally or psychologically abusive, or a narcissist. And this could also bring like you as that figure too. So sometimes people don't even realize it. Like the people that are like yelling the loudest about narcissists are sometimes the most narcissistic people you'll find. And that's because Pluto can cause you to play out that energy, or to draw it in from outside sources. And so if you're not acting on it by being manipulative or, difficult in some way, or narcissistic, or, vampiric, then you're going to be drawing in people that display those qualities. And that's not always forever. You can start to learn how to work with that energy and how to recognize what's going on. And Pluto helps you to recognize that very intensely. But that is something that I've seen as a theme. It's also associated with like magic, right? And the occult and all of those things, because there's that psychic energy and that energy of drawing things in or manipulating reality through like psychic means. And so that is part of that energy too. And we'll get into more of the medical astrology stuff in the next slide, but it is associated with tumors and malignancy because of that correspondence with like radiation and things like that with the atomic bomb, and also just because that's what Pluto kind of represents, is this like energy around tumors and all of that, the colon and toxicity. But when you see Pluto in the chart in a very negative way, that doesn't always mean cancer or tumors. So I don't want that to be like the thing that you think. And we'll get into that a little bit more so. So excretion, purge, release, and surrender, non-attachment to the physical. So that's something that we already talked about. And it is a transformational and transpersonal planet. The Pluto cycle actually lasts 248 years. So it's like a very, very long cycle. Nobody will go through an entire Pluto cycle within one lifetime. You actually won't even get to a Pluto opposition because you would be like well over 100 years old. And so, you'll get to that sextile, that square, and that trine, which we'll talk about, but you don't go around the full cycle like you do with Saturn, for example. And so it takes roughly 14 to 30 years for Pluto to transit each sign because it does have that irregular elliptical orbit. And so during certain time periods when Pluto is a little bit closer to the Earth from our vantage point, it's going to be moving more quickly through the zodiac. And so it'll move through a sign, in 14 years, which is similar to Neptune. And other times you're going to have Pluto farther out, and it's going to take a full 30 years to transit just one sign. And so what points you get in the Pluto cycle and what Pluto transits you get are really dependent on when you were born and how fast Pluto was moving around that time and into the future. So everybody's going to have a different time frame and a different experience with that. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. And if you like this video, please be sure to like it, subscribe to my channel, and share it with some friends if you feel like it could be beneficial to them in some way. And if you want to download the full webinar, the link again is down in the description below, or you can purchase the full Mastering the Outer Planet series so you can dive deep into Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, all of the different transits and cycles, and what the chart placement of these planets means for you personally, as well as a free bonus webinar on April 11th, all about Jupiter in astrology. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.